So for the benefit of those not only sitting in the room with us, but also for those who are tuning in online, I have been reminded that it is helpful when questions are asked for me to repeat them into the microphone. Otherwise, the nice people who are journeying with us on YouTube, and we thank you, by the way, for all of you who have tuned into our class. It's interesting, we have some people who follow us who live nowhere near WRT. So one of the nice things about the internet is we can reach a wide audience, some folks who tune in from overseas. So thank you. We don't see you, but we feel that you are with us and grateful for your interest. I'll do my best to repeat questions that are asked, or if I don't have to run around the room too many times, I'll give you the microphone, and just, you have to hold it about an inch from your face. It doesn't work over here. So you need to speak into the microphone to ask your question, which is why I might just take your question and then repeat it so that the online students can follow. That's housekeeping number one. Housekeeping number two. At the end of today's session at 1:30, we're going to end promptly, and you're going to see me make a beeline for the door. I love you so much, but I can't stay to schmooze today on account of family coming in this afternoon, and I'm on very much kitchen duty, as soon as I get home. So the time we have a timeline of, we're doing a pre-Thanksgiving dinner because we have too many people in our lives whom we love and can't have everyone over on Thursday. So that's the plan. So we're doing. Oh my goodness, the aroma. I would never steal someone else's mashed potatoes, not because I don't like their mashed potatoes, but because Kelly makes the best. Yeah, okay. That's housekeeping number two. Housekeeping number three. In case you are joining us for the first time or the first time in a long time, we resolved last week to add a session. So we're adding a more informal fifth session on December 14th. We can't meet next weekend. It's a holiday weekend. The weekend after that, unfortunately, on the 7th, I have a commitment that conflicts. But on the 14th, we'll do kind of a semester wrap-up. And it's going to be more of a Q&A, open discourse, ask me anything. I will fully disclose what I do not know. Noon on Sunday, December 14th. Vicky. I know there's a conflict. Yeah, unfortunately. We'll tape that one too, though. Will what? Yeah, so then the other thing is the 14th beginning at 2 p.m. So if you do come on the 14th and want to stay for the afternoon, you may, but you may want to bring a lunch to this session, though there will be some nosh served. We begin our winter movie series sponsored by Freebirds, open to all, by the way, member, non-member, any age. So we're showing 3 films, one in December, one I think on January 11th, and one on January 25th. 3 Sundays, approximately 2 to 4:30, 2 to 5 at the latest, where we have some fun getting together, some food and drink, lead a conversation around subjects of interest pertaining to 3 films. This year, I have selected the following theme for our movie series. It is the Jewish mother in cinema. So it's going to be all about it, but it's interesting. It's not just crass entertainment. It's a little crass entertainment. It's going to be about the stereotype of the Jewish mother played out as a cinema archetype, and also how that stereotype gets subverted in cinema. So we're showing 3 films. The first is Goodbye Columbus, which is based on the Philip Roth book. So we're going to watch that as kind of like the paradigm. And then we're going to watch 2 movies that may subvert some of the associations that we have with Jewish mother. One is an Israeli film that's going to be shown on January 11th, which is actually in which the mother figure is also a warrioress and a paratrooper and a really interesting character. And then the third one is another film, Natalie Portman's directorial debut, the film version of A Tale of Love and Darkness. They'll read the book by Amos Oz because it's really an incredible memoir of where his mother is a central figure in his memoir of growing up at the dawn of the state of Israel. So it's going to be a really fun, meaningful, interesting series. You'll laugh, you'll cry. You'll tell all your friends and they'll come too. Okay, that's housekeeping. We now begin. Today, I will begin I received some very thoughtful emails week to week on the subject of our class. And one came my way that I will share with you. It's kind of like two questions that I thought were worthy of mention, but I don't have deep answers. One is, I'm paraphrasing here, what to do about the conundrum that we raised last week of asymmetric warfare, in which, in the case of the war that Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas have been fighting for the last 2 and more years. We're officially in a ceasefire. I think that most analysts of the war would say it is premature to say the war is over. And this past weekend even is dispositive of that uncertainty. There's been, kind of mutual recrimination who started it, but Israel did carry out airstrikes in Gaza. Both have accused the other side of violating the ceasefire. About 20 Palestinians killed, including Israel, the IDF says, including some Hamas operatives who were on their target list, but that's not really, I don't know. The bigger question was, what do we do about asymmetric warfare, in which the game is kind of rigged? It is actually designed to induce the stronger military power to react or overreact in such a way that actually lends moral legitimacy in the eyes of those observing from the outside to the victim. All of these words can be weaponized, politicized, and have been, and therefore the cycle continues. The answer is I don't know. But I have been listening faithfully for more than 2 years to a commentator whose name was not known to me before October 7th, but who was raised by the moral philosopher and podcast host and author Sam Harris. And if you don't follow his podcast, Making Sense by Sam Harris, the non-subscriber model is you usually get about 45 minutes to an hour of really interesting commentary. And he's commented on all sorts of subjects. He talks a lot about AI. He talks a lot about religion. He's came to prominence as a kind of very outspoken, ardent atheist. But in recent years, he has also gone to the mat for Zionism, just as a moral cause, which is really interesting. And he has featured several times on his podcast, which you can pay either what you want or the recommended, I think, $70 or $80 a year to get the full stream, which is usually like an hour and a half to 2 hours per episode. John Spencer has been a frequent featured guest. Al, can you just move the walkie-talkie out of earshot, or close the door, Andrew? Thanks. Shh, thank you. So Sam Harris on Making Sense, his podcast, introduced me to a guy named John Spencer, who is a senior professor of urban warfare at West Point, and I think an absolutely brilliant commentator. If you are just interested in war, his entire frame for understanding the Israel-Hamas war is war, which sounds like it should be so intuitively obvious as not to need to be said, and yet I believe that that is almost the last thing we have encountered in the public discourse around the war, is using war as the frame of reference for understanding the war. So I don't want to say much else, but he's really one of the world's, I think, most cogent analysts of asymmetric warfare. This is what this guy studies for a living. And I had the privilege of meeting him at a kind of closed-door meeting in a home in Mamaroneck about 3 weeks ago. Such a thoughtful, intelligent, interesting guy. 55 years old, just really compelling. So look up either John Spencer, West Point, but he's kind of all over the place these days. See if you can catch him online, or subscribe, or just download the Sam Harris Making Sense podcast and look for some episodes where it notes in the description that he features John Spencer. He's my asymmetric warfare go-to guy, and he's been to Gaza, 6 times since October 7th. So he really is. He's one of the very few Western journalists, not journalists, but Western people that Israel, the IDF, has let in. I'm sure in part because the IDF understands that his perspective will end up being parsed as sympathetic to the IDF because, again, he thinks like people who make war for a living think. That's his entire framework for how is this war being fought. Israel, by policy, the IDF does not allow Western journalists to be embedded with the IDF in Gaza. That has been their consistent position from the beginning. I mean, they will tell you it's for safety, but I'm sure it is also because they have legitimate concerns about what will be broadcast from the front. Hamas has the opposite strategy. You know, as we're of course well familiar, the more they can broadcast devastation, the more they have accurately assessed they will garner sympathy from the world that is horrified by the images of devastation, up close and personal. Spencer would say something like, yeah, that's what war looks like. That's why you don't want to go into war, because it's that awful. Okay. The other question is there a chance that Bibi and or his coalition could stay in power just by not holding elections? Now, the person who's better to answer this question is Yoel. There's always a chance that something unprecedented will happen in Israeli life. But to my understanding, that would set a new precedent for breaking with political norms in Israel, because there is a scheduled election every 4 years. Because it is parliamentary, unicameral Knesset coalition politics, often elections are held more frequently than every 4 years in Israel. I mean, there was a less than 2-year stretch where I think 5 or 6 elections were held in recent memory. Between 2021 or 2020 and 2022, Israel formed and collapsed 4 different governments before finally creating a coalition, the one that we more or less still have today, 64 seats in the Knesset, which has managed to hold power since November of 2022. So for exactly 3 years now, we've had the same government. There have been, of course, dismissals and comings and goings and some horse trading that's happening along the way. But fundamentally, Bibi has maintained his grip on power in Israel. And I see no reason to believe necessarily that there's a maneuver to be made, certainly not one to be made legally, that would allow Bibi to, claim that he continues to govern on some wartime provision or emergency provision beyond the national election that is scheduled for, I think, November of 2026, right? Yoel, do I have that more or less right? I'm an amateur here. Okay.
The only thing I would add is compared to the American situation.
Right.
The constitutional amendment limiting the president to 2 terms, and there are rumors that a certain president who we know would like to stay for a 3rd term.
Right, so Yoel says, well, the apt comparison would be to here in America, where we have a president who, until recently, had indulged in rhetoric, hinting at, well, maybe I will keep going after a 2-term, even though there's a constitutional limit to presidents can serve only 2 terms in office. And I don't think that non-consecutive abridges that provision. Right? The fact that these are 2 non-consecutive terms for Donald Trump does not change the fact that there is a constitutional limit on running again. But I wouldn't put it past anyone in this era in our national and global politics for something unprecedented to happen, because it seems like the word unprecedented is highly precedented these days. Okay, so I've been tasked today with framing 10 years of history. And this is a bit of a vexing and challenging task because it's the last 10 years. So what I begin with the presumption that everyone in this room more or less remembers all of this. So there are going to be times when I say things where you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, because it was like yesterday. It's also, I believe, hard to make sense of history when it is really part of the present moment. Like, is it even history if it's the last 10 years? Because I think we're still making sense of it. But the arc of 10 years from 2015 to 2025, while artificial, being a nice 10-year block in a year that starts with a 5 and ends with a 5, is nevertheless a meaningful unit of time for us to consider. And perhaps contrary to your expectations, and maybe even my own, even as of a week ago, when I was still thinking about how do I want to show up and talk about the last 10 years on November 23rd. The main story that I'd like to tell is actually not the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I believe that the arc of history that we might wish to contemplate resides in a kind of external circle of affairs. So if you think about how we could talk about the last 10 years for Israel, centering Israel, like what have the last 10 years meant for Israel, and what, perhaps we'll talk about this on December 14th, do these past 10 years portend, let's say, for the next 10 years for Israel? You can look at the narrowmost circle, like imagine the cross-section of an onion or a tree trunk, right? You know, the rings, right? And the innermost rings tell one story, and then as you get closer to the perimeter, you're telling a different story. You can always tell the narrowmost story of, well, Israel's entanglement with the Palestinians, an entanglement that, as we have tried to elucidate over the last 3 weeks, is not reducible to slogans like occupation, because on the one hand, you do have a military occupation of the West Bank, which is chopped up still according to the Oslo formula of areas A, B, and C. And we talked a little bit about what that means for the lives of Palestinians and also how it has played out in West Bank Palestinian Fatah party politics, the party of Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, who continues to be the figurehead leader, at least, in the West Bank for the Palestinian people. And then you have a blockade that has affected Gaza, and we talked about the withdrawal of Israel from the settlements in Gaza under Sharon just months before he was felled and put into a vegetative state by a massive stroke. And that was last week's business. So we could talk about Israel-Palestine politics, but that would be the narrowmost frame. The frame I'm actually most interested in for today is actually the one that encircles it, which is regional politics. And viewed through that lens, the story we are going to tell today is principally the one that begins with something called the JCPOA, better known as the Iran deal, in 2015, which had been in negotiations since about 2013, and ends with the 12-day war in June of 2025. So the 10-year arc that we're looking at, I think, is actually the story of Israel and Iran. And we're going to focus in on that. And then the Palestinian story takes on, I think, a different significance, no less important perhaps, but one that is embedded in a wider regional context. And then, of course, the widest circle we could draw, which is also worthwhile, is Israel on the world stage over the last 10 years and what has happened to Israel. So, and it's a very, very complicated story, because you could argue that the world, while being almost obsessively singularly focused on the Israel-Palestine question, has downplayed the larger question of Israel-Iran, the regional question, and then has also given perhaps too much emphasis to Israel on the world stage. And that's where you talk about, well, what has happened in the last 10 years with Israel vis-a-vis the United Nations, with Israel vis-a-vis the West? How is Israel seen now in the West? What is Israel's relationships with the world powers, where it is now actually competing at the highest level with the big first world countries? It has an economy to be reckoned with, a technological enterprise innovation sector that is almost second to none on the planet, and therefore you can't ignore Israel. So even the idea of activism that is directed at the non-existence of Israel, like wipe from the river to the sea in the literal sense of that term, like wiping Israel off the map, it's absolutely preposterous. A, it's not going to happen. But B, it's not going to happen, right? Israel's not going to allow that to happen, and the West won't allow it to happen, as much as the West is also kind of a hotbed of anti-Israel activism and rhetoric. So it's very, very complicated. So the frame I'm most interested in today is that middle frame, but of course we're going to stray into the outer frame, the biggest frame, Israel on the world stage, and of course we will spend considerable time talking about Israel and the Palestinians. So that's sort of like my preamble to my remarks. The negotiations for the joint plan of action, or the JPOA, which eventually became the joint, I forget what the C stands for. Comprehensive, thank you, plan of action. Joint, thank you, Jim. Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the JCPOA, or the Iran deal. Negotiations for this deal began in 2013. And I'll just kind of like paint a couple of pictures for you. First of all, 2015, July 14th, 2015, in Vienna, the JCPOA was signed and ratified. So after 2 years of negotiations, the group of powerful nations, including, of course, the states under the administration of Barack Obama, signed the deal. Where was I? I was actually on a plane to Israel at that time. I was traveling with a rabbinic delegation, and I landed to turn on my phone, and all of a sudden, like, my feed like started popping up with all sorts of news alerts that the agreement had been signed in Vienna. So what was this all about? Negotiations started at the impetus of Obama in November 2013. And if you're thinking about what was happening regionally at that time, Syria was riven by an absolutely gruesome, grinding civil war in which, by that point, at least 800,000 had been killed under the administration of Bashar al-Assad, the just horrific autocrat in Syria, correctly accused of using chemical weapons against his own people. Honestly, for me, now I'm just editorializing, the moment I started to feel most anxious about Barack Obama's Middle East policy was when he spoke in front of Congress about a red line, and I believe it was August of 2013, delineating that should Syria use chemical weapons against its own people, that would be a red line that would signal now it was time for American military intervention. But when it actually happened, Obama punted the matter back to Congress and said, actually, Congress will decide, and no action was actually taken at that time. And I felt that it was a missed opportunity to project American strength in the region. There's been very thoughtful analysis around this, a huge feature in The Atlantic from shortly after about the Obama doctrine, basically said at that point Obama had become such a weathered cynic that he truly believed there was nothing he could do to change the game in the Middle East, and therefore was most inclined to withdraw from the space. That's a summation of 30 great pages of journalism by Jeffrey Goldberg, now the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Highly recommend it if you can. I think it's called The Obama Doctrine. I'm sure it's archived online. So we were watching this unfolding, of course, as American Jews as well, because as these negotiations started to ramp up, the effect they had on the Jewish community was palpable. And I remember hating being the senior rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple at the time in what I would describe politically as a purple congregation, with plenty of voters who, reliably vote Republican, plenty of voters who reliably vote Democrat, a majority of voters who really like Jews and Judaism and who care about the state of Israel, even if they don't define themselves as ardent Zionists. Most people in our community are kind of aligned on this. But I saw the way in which the politics of the Iran deal was tearing at the unity, the fabric, the tightness of the Jewish community. And I was being asked to play something that I am not, which is a political commentator instead of a spiritual leader and a teacher of Torah. for the first time. Then I realized, like, oh, Blake, that's the role. Oh, people think you're the Israel expert. I guess you got to become one. Like, start reading. That people were asking me, well, what do I think about the Iran deal? And there were two basic positions on this. Nobody that I know, nobody credible, thought it was the greatest thing ever. It would forever stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Forget about what politicians were saying. The conversations on the inside went something like this. The people who were in support of the deal had on their side those member nations of the pro-deal coalition whose basic position was this is a necessary compromise. The trade-off, Iran is not just inching, but vaulting toward a nuclear weapon. We see that it has these refineries. We see that it has access to fissile material, uranium, that can be refined into weapons-grade nuclear fissile material. And despite the Iranians' official position that, no, we only want this to, supplement our energy needs, and really? In the most oil-rich country in the world where you can get subsidized oil for 79 cents a gallon? No. We saw right through it. So nobody sensible was saying that this is a great thing, but they were saying, well, the options are either Iran breaks out with a nuclear weapon sometime in the next year or so, or best case scenario, we could push this back. We could push back their nuclear ambitions through negotiations. 10 years likely, 15 years absolute best case scenario. And by the way, in 2015, that actually to many people seemed appealing. And on their side, I would add, they had the majority of the Israeli nuclear establishment, because even though it is not an official public position, it is a well-known secret that Israel is a nuclear power. Right? That's the whole program that began in Dimona in the Negev in the south under Golda Meir. That's not our subject of discourse. If you want to know about it, read Gordis, read a whole bunch, read anywhere. It's kind of like everyone knows Israel has a nuke, and that's one of the reasons why Israel has created a kind of dome, an impenetrable dome, at least in terms of deterrence power. And of course, that explains why Iran, as the aspirational hegemon in the region, the nation that most wants to exert its influence across an entire axis of power that encompasses, that enfolds the Middle East kind of like a pincer grip in warfare, so you can surround your enemy on three sides and squeeze them. Iran, Syria, Lebanon in the north and east, stretching all the way through the Gulf and encompassing bypassing Saudi Arabia, who is its enemy nation, really its counterweight in terms of regional power, but also including the rebels in Yemen known as the Houthis. And that's one of the reasons Iran has been so invested in empowering the Houthis, because that's this part of the pincer, right? So they want to create as much influence, and Iran developed this tactic over many years of not so much directly engaging with Israel, with its enemies, but rather empowering groups that we would call terrorist cells on Israel's borders, namely Hezbollah, which is probably ideologically most aligned with the Islamic regime in Iran. And I have to be careful when I say Iran, because Iran is basically a rogue state that is run by an Islamic would-be caliphate that oppresses the will of its own people. That's Iran today. So when I say the Islamic regime in Iran, I'm talking about, it's like if you're fans of The Handmaid's Tale, it's like Gilead. It was a coup d'etat in the late 70s, in 1979, overthrown by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Anyway, so you've got Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militia stationed in southern Lebanon, which is Iran's chief proxy. This is also why Iran got so involved in the Syrian civil war right around this time, was also doing everything it could in its power to prop up the Assad regime and suppress the rebels. And I am taking four-dimensional chess and making it like one-dimensional checkers. Syria's civil war was actually like 7 factions fighting against each other. It was positively biblical in the way it unfolded. And that's why what's going to happen with Syria? Ask someone smarter and better educated than I am. I do not know, but it is one of the big questions for the next 10 years. Will Israel actually have a treaty with Syria? Maybe. Maybe not. And then, of course, down in the south, you have the Houthis, this rebel group in Yemen, fighting against the Saudis, who are on the same Arabian Peninsula, and Iran saw its ability to influence the direction there as well, so it gets involved in empowering the Houthis so that Israel can be attacked on multiple fronts, right? That's the Iranian game. So the Israeli nuclear establishment, like its top scientists and politicians who have been paying attention to the nuclear program, were largely in favor of the deal, as was a small part of the far Israeli left, but the strong majority, like a super majority of Israelis, even like labor voting. We've learned about the Labor Party when we studied about Rabbi a few weeks ago with my dear friend Rabbi Katsu. Even moderate left Israelis, which, you know, don't exist in great numbers anymore, but the kind of like moderate Israeli establishment was very, very anxious about the deal. You could say some of that is because the politics of anxiety were played up to the hilt. Netanyahu, who has always been mortally opposed to the deal, and again, Netanyahu's supporters view him as this is something they like about him a lot, that he has been absolutely uncompromising about allowing Iran to get a nuclear weapon, even when those who were supportive of the deal said, this is foolish. By refusing to engage with a deal, you will accelerate exactly the thing you say you don't want, right? And that was the Obama argument, that we're kind of backed into a corner here. The issue became even more I think, heated in the world Jewish community, especially here in America, when AIPAC planted a flag in the sand, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and basically said, this is a bad deal, and we should support only those elected officials who will vote against the deal when it comes before Congress, and we should do everything in our power not to support any elected officials who are in favor of the deal. Now, Obama, again, a very influential president with his own Democratic Party at the time, really used his people in Congress to whip the Democrats into a kind of position of lockstep conformity, although there were a number of Democratic senators and representatives who broke with their president and therefore with the party. Increasingly, the Iran deal turned Israel into a partisan football, right? Turned Israel into a wedge issue, I think, in the most serious and concerning way that we had up until that point seen in American life. Many of you may recall March 3rd, 2015, just a little over 10 years ago, when Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress. He was invited expressly by the Republican members of Congress, and he used that pulpit to warn against the emerging Iran nuclear threat, or the Iran nuclear deal rather than the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, calling it a very bad deal that would pave Iran's path to a nuclear bomb. And I would remind us that he had the perfect text to work with because he came right on the cusp of Purim. And if you will recall, Purim is the story of a wicked, wicked Persian fellow named Haman, who's in league with a kind of dunderhead king named Ahasuerus, who really is mostly interested in throwing parties. And oh, by the way, also comes with a nice program of genocide for the Jews. Right? That's the story of Purim. It takes place in Iran. Like you have the perfect story. And so Netanyahu, speaking not just to Congress, but beyond Congress, to a world audience, but especially to the global Jewish community, he gets up there and says, this is a very bad deal. A number of Democratic congresspersons sat it out. They boycotted the event. They said it was a hijacking of the American political system by a foreign operative. Like, to allow Netanyahu to have that audience at that time was disgraceful. Nevertheless, it did not sink the deal. There was enough support here in the States and across the world for the deal. The framework was outlined, the parameters were agreed upon and finalized, and the deal was fully signed July 14th in Vienna as I was landing in Israel. So I had a very interesting week in Israel. I mean, everyone we talked to, and that included just Israelis on the street, military top brass, rabbis in congregations, both Reform and Orthodox. It was fascinating. I did not meet many Israelis who were happy that the deal had been signed that week. I'm just telling you, that was the opinion on the street. And yet there are some people in Israel who said, well, that's politics, man. You have to compromise. You have to get rid of things you want. Now, ironic that, imagine an alternate reality, what we call, like, there's a movie about this called Sliding Doors. You remember? It's a good movie. I think Gwyneth Paltrow was in it. Where, it kind of envisioned, well, just if one thing had gone differently on a train, like you could be in an entirely different timeline of reality. So imagine a reality in which the Iran deal had never been signed. Like, what would have happened? Would we have been dealing with I think that a lot would have been different, because around the same time, this became an issue that was centralized in the candidate Trump first campaign for president. And so I had the distinct pleasure, okay, I wouldn't call it that, but I had the opportunity to see candidate Trump address the following year's APAC policy conference in DC at the Verizon Center, where I think where their hockey team plays. It's at what are they called? Capitals, thank you. And Trump got up there on the stage, and I had to leave. Some of my colleagues walked out in protest. I walked out because I was worried that my dad was going to have a heart attack. We were still not really used to Trumpian rhetoric at that point, and I was sort of like shocked about the way he was talking about Barack Obama and about the sitting president. How could he say these things? But he did center his speech for a largely Jewish and entirely pro-Israel audience around how bad the Iran deal was, and how one of the very first things he would do when he became president was tear up the deal, pull out of the deal. That is a promise he made good on. Right? It was a really important campaign promise, and it did not actually meaningfully move the needle of how Jews voted in 2016. But interestingly enough, I think that it was seen in hindsight by many American Jews, even those who were skeptical of Trump, as a good thing that we pulled out of the deal. I'm of two minds about this. I spoke to the congregation about the deal on Rosh Hashanah morning 2016. You can go back, it's online, it's on my blog, I think, I don't know. But I basically said, look, being Jewish means that you can hold both yes and no. And this is a complicated matter. And the way we think about things that are fait accompli is different from the way we think about things that are in formation. It's kind of like when people ask me today about what do I think about Mamdani. I'm like, well, what are you asking me for? He's going to be the mayor. And now we have to come up with a different playbook than we did one day before he became mayor. So same thing with the Iran deal. By September 2016, it was long since established fact, like it or not. I said, look, I didn't think it was a great deal. But now that it is, now that it's there on paper, or now that it's there, I didn't think it was a good idea to pull out. I was concerned there would be too much consequence of how America's standing in the world, and that it would only accelerate Iran's race to get a nuke if we were to pull out. Well, it does seem to be what happened. Like, we pulled out of the deal under Trump administration number 1. A number of things happened in that administration that I will talk about. And as a result, Iran seems to have gone right back to acquiring and refining fissile material to make a nuclear warhead, or at least a number of warheads to jeopardize Israel's standing as the one nuclear power in the region, the only others close to it being Pakistan and India. So Israel was in this kind of, like, I think, lose-lose situation. And again, the arc of history that I'm most interested in is the one that begins with the deal and ends with the 12-day Iran war. But we'll keep talking so that you can hear a little bit more. Just so you understand what was in the deal originally, first provision. Iran would have limits on its nuclear ambitions in the following ways. And this was intended to last for a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 25 years. It would cap its centrifuges at around 5,000. It would enrich less than 3.67% of uranium that can be enriched for nuclear weapons, and it would stockpile less than 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. It would redesign its Arak reactor so that it had no path to using plutonium. It would build no new heavy water reactors, and it would submit to enhanced International Atomic Energy Association monitoring, including something ambiguously called an additional protocol. It would also benefit in the following ways. It would receive sanction relief that would be a phased lifting of the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran from the UN, the US, and the EU on oil, banking, and trade. And it would regain up to $100 billion worth of previously frozen assets. And finally, there would be a verification program and a sunsetting program where the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, would have access to all of its nuclear sites, and that if violations were detected, that the JCPOA signers and framers could snap back the sanctions, right? You might remember the word snap back came up a lot during these negotiations. These core restrictions were set to expire after a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 15 years with ongoing oversight. The deal was trying to extend the breakout time, right? The time from we've got the material to we can make a nuke with the material, from what at the time was deemed to be just 2 to 3 months. Like if Iran could get the material, it could make a nuke in 2 to 3 months. The provisions intended to set them back to a timeline of about a year. Now, again, the opponents of the deal said, well, that's not a good deal at all. Like, you're not really creating much. And so again, like, we don't have the opportunity to live in a sliding door reality. We can live only in the reality that we have chosen to live in and that has been selected for us, but here we are. And we'll see where this leads. I mean, it leads to the US joining a significant bombing raid aimed at degrading Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its physical infrastructure, completely decapitating its scientific program by just assassinating, eliminating all of its top nuclear scientists, and assassinating all of its top military brass. Like, with the exception of the Ayatollahs themselves, the mullahs who run the show in Iran, the Israeli and US joint assault on Iran over 12 days in June was as comprehensive as it gets for a strategic surgical military action. Astonishing. And I think a game changer, though again, all of the discourse in the hours and days following the 12-day war was, well, did we really set it back? Was Fordo, did they really get that deep into the caves and the bunkers and that built into a mountain? Did we really have the penetrative power with our arsenal of our own weapons, which is why the U.S. was, kind of eager to join the fight, or Israel was eager to have us join the fight because only we had the weapons that could go that deep into the mountains and really degrade their nuclear capacity? Well, to this day, no one knows, but there appears to be a growing consensus, and we asked Spencer about this at that lunch meeting a few weeks ago, that they did a very effective job of setting Iran's nuclear program back by years, not forever. Because if Iran wants to, build back better after this devastating June that it has had and the year leading up to it, it's going to go after the nukes again. Like, this is just a cycle. It's just whack-a-mole, my friends. Okay, hand in the back. Did I see one? Yeah, Darren.
Over this period from 2013, call it, where was the Saudis? Because that's their arch enemy. Saudis today don't have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so the question is, during this period of the unfolding of the JCPOA, 2013 to 2016, where were the Saudis? I don't know. I'm going to have to look that one up. It's a great question. So when I go back between now and December 14th, we'll put that on the docket for our Q&A. It's a great question. The Saudis, in my consciousness, have really only emerged after the signing of the Abraham Accords, which begin in 2020. That's where the Saudis typically enter the conversation. So if you're doing what I'm doing, which is kind of assembling a course on the fly, and I'm not an expert in Middle East history, but kind of play one on TV. For the sake of my research, it's too narrow to have encompassed the question of where were the Saudis 2015 to 2020. But it's a question that obviously has a meaningful answer that weighs in on what would happen after 2020. I would say that one of the things we're going to learn is the Saudis were quietly or not so quietly developing their strategy to join the West in certain ways, at least in terms of perceived legitimacy on the world stage. The Saudis have long been making a bid not to be treif, not to be not kosher in the West. I mean, it's fascinating because after 9/11, I think they saw the writing on the wall. And after the ISIS resurgence, the Saudis in their own neighborhood said, we have a bit of an Islamofascism problem in our neck of the woods. That's true. We know that. We also know that with although the king is still the king, the guy running the show, and I have to find out when he assumed power, I think it was around 2019, is MBS, who was just hanging out with Trump this week, the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And you had the Khashoggi murder, like the gruesome dismemberment, all of that stuff. Nevertheless, the overarching aspiration of the Saudi kingdom has been to obtain some measure of legitimacy in the West, which is why they're really deep into golf, right? They have like their own rival league to the PGA, which is a big deal. And tennis. Right, but it's a very canny enterprise on the part of the Saudis. It's like, well, let's literally play the same game that they play in the West. Like, let's finally stop doing things that make us treif in the eyes of the West on their face, like stop making it illegal for women to drive cars. That was one of the first reforms that MBS did internally. So there have been a number of, it's sort of like Saudi glasnost, right? Where it's going to lead, though, not to the dissolution of the empire, clearly. They've got so much petroleum wealth that they can play this game, but they've hardly become like a moderate Western democracy in any way, shape, or form. But it is interesting to see the dance they're doing where they seem to be putting some eggs delicately in the basket of actually having a relationship with Israel, even if it won't acknowledge one. Right? It's very interesting. But your question still remains for me to do some homework on. What was happening 2013 to 2020 in Saudi Arabia? How did we arrive at this new Saudis emerging as, hi, we're here, we're not that bad, right? We dress different from you, but we're really just like you because we love money. Love money, right? So we can talk your language. All right, we want to be capitalists. Okay, yeah, of course. No idea. The question is, what is the population of Saudi Arabia? But that one you can ask my colleague Google. That one's easy. Ask AI. They'll know. They'll know like the population from the last census. Okay. So now we go to other matters starting around 2015. So at the same time that Netanyahu was on his juggernaut, his press junket, right, trying to convince the West that the deal was a bad deal, he actually had just been voted in narrowly and was able to form his fourth government. Recall that Netanyahu was elected for the first time by popular direct vote, which is very interesting. It's the only time in Israeli history this was done was the special election called after the assassination of Rabin. As I pointed this out, Yoel, a couple weeks ago, correctly observed, many Israelis were just absolutely, kind of like smacking themselves in the head that Peres waited so long to call elections after Rabin was assassinated. Had only Shimon Peres called for an early election, he probably would have been voted Israel's next prime minister, and not just interim prime minister. But instead, a direct election was held after a very serious and devastating, at least to the Israeli psyche, to say nothing of body count, campaign of suicide bombings by Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas in the winter and spring of 1996. And that fear mentality that is always promoted when Israel is living under terror, resulted, at least in part, in the first time that Netanyahu was elected prime minister at the tender age of 47. So March 2015, Netanyahu is now in power for the fourth time, and we've seen there have been interregnums where Ehud Olmert was prime minister, or Ariel Sharon was prime minister, and Ehud Olmert was prime minister, Ehud Barak, then Ehud Olmert, so lots of Ehuds. Okay. You may recall the following term. This is one I was like, oh, I remember that. In October of 2015, stretching all the way into the second quarter of 2016, you had something known variously in our part of the world as the knife intifada or the lone wolf intifada. Now successfully prevented from carrying out large-scale mass acts of terror thanks to the security barrier, Palestinians nevertheless engaged in individual stabbings, car rammings, shootings, but the stabbings were kind of the thing that made the headlines. It's like, okay, they don't have access to high, impact explosives, or machine guns, but they can still cause significant disruption in Israeli society. They can create fear. They can create a sense of we will never make peace with the Zionist enemy, and by the way, vice versa, we will never make peace with the Arabs on the more extreme sectors of Israeli society, thanks to just a few people, mostly teenagers, with handmade, weapons, not of mass destruction, but enough to create mass chaos and real disruption in Israeli and Palestinian society. From Gaza, often these stabbings would be the signal for Hamas to send rockets over its fence with Israel and into kibbutzim and communities along the periphery. Again, we talked last time about different kinds of ballistics and how rockets are kind of crude, unguided weapons. But that's what Hamas had stockpiled, and it would send over rockets anytime there was violence in Israel or the West Bank. Syria, aligned with Iran and Hezbollah, were meanwhile engaged in a shadow war with Israel. So from 2015 to 2018, Israel actually conducted somewhere on the order of 100, maybe as many as 200 airstrikes on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and in Syria to prevent advanced weapons transfers getting to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon from Iran through Syria to Lebanon. So Israel is still very focused on the north at this point, and I can corroborate that just anecdotally. The many times I traveled to Israel during this period, we'd always meet with some military, really impressive official with all sorts of stars and bars, and they would always say, yeah, the next big war is coming from the north. Israel was deeply influenced by the Second Lebanon War of 2006, with the kidnappings and a high death toll. And although it is parsed as an Israeli victory, the cost allowed Israel's military establishment to conclude that it had been caught with its pants down and that the real dangers were in the north. So again, one of the things that we have seen unfold in 2024 and 2025 is the fruition of 20 years, almost 18 years, of very intensive Israeli military and intelligence work to make sure that whenever the next war came with the North, Israel would not be caught with its pants down. Now, did we know that they were coming up with this plan to jerry-rig pagers or the ability to take out a single Iranian operative in a Tehran apartment? I mean, it's unbelievable, and Spencer corroborated this a few weeks ago as well, that the technological and intelligence advances that Israel made, particularly in the north in this last war, have definitively changed war forever in the West. And guess who's studying it? We are, right? The Pentagon has a lot of dollars and interest in learning from the Israelis how they did it. That is a story that I will buy every book on this once it's written. It is an unbelievable story. But I just want to, again, some of what we're doing here in this class is connecting dots. Israel also has its own domestic things to think about, so you will remember some of these. Midway through the Trump term, just in time, by the way, for the midterm elections, the U.S. moved its Israel embassy to Jerusalem. You know, in the reform movement, this was met with a lot of consternation. And the official position of the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, was to denounce the move as disruptive of the status quo and not conducive to any eventual peace with the Palestinians. Many of the people in this community shared with me their own, corrective, in their view, that no, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Why shouldn't we just say the thing? I have actually long identified with the latter position. I long felt that the embassy issue was a lot of politics over nothing, and that I was pleasantly surprised when the outcome was, in fact, what the supporters of moving the embassy had said it would be all along, which is, if not a nothing burger, but it did not result in large-scale violence. It did nothing to build trust between Israel and Palestinians. Okay, well, there are some, Trump would say, well, who cares? Trump also froze assistance to the Palestinians. Trump took a very unaccommodating stance toward the Palestinians at that time. You could perhaps argue that that position of non-accommodation, no peace, is not unrelated to what happened on October 7th. Right? The Palestinians do have grievances. The fact that they enacted those grievances in such horrific bloodshed is not exculpatory, merely partially explanatory. Does that make sense? All right. I try to be very careful in my language, so I don't want to overstate or understate the case. Meanwhile, by the end of 2019, Israel had responded to a protest march or a protest movement in Gaza called the Great March of Return, where week in, week out, Gazans at Hamas's direction were protesting along the border. So what you have are these kids on one side of the border, and then on the Israeli side of the border, you have kids, 18 years old, 19 years old, heavy artillery in hand, itchy trigger fingers, right? Very, very anxious situation along the Gaza border, using their scopes, using what, rudimentary tools they had to see, well, what are the others up to? Well, the end result of this protest movement is, by the end of 2019, almost 200 Palestinians had been killed by IDF fire, with thousands wounded. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. But it was an incredibly tense border situation, and in my view, again, if you want to say, well, what's leading us to, what are the signs that we could have seen coming, that we did not see coming with October 7th, I think you got to take a very long view of the region, and the very, very, zoom that lens in. What was happening on that Gaza border? It's not like nothing was happening in the last 5 or 6 years prior to October 7th. Also, the increasingly bellicose rhetoric of Netanyahu's government was roiling Israeli society. One of the most salient issues that reached us here in our reform temples was something called the nation-state law, passed in July of 2018, which defined Israel into law as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Now, a lot of its supporters said, again, kind of like with the embassy move, well, duh, we are. What's the problem? Viewed from the position either of the Palestinians or especially the left, including the Jewish left, it was an unnecessary rhetorical and policy needle in the eye of the Palestinians and of Israel's 20% of citizens who are not Jewish, right? So it officially diminish the status of Arabic as a language and the share of non-Jewish people in the democracy of Israel. So those of us who have been concerned about the erosion of Western democracy here in the States, in the EU, witness places like Hungary, Viktor Orban, the aspirational autocrat whose playbook has been very influential with like the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025. They've learned a lot from watching the slow erosion of protections and freedoms of the press and of assembly and whatnot in Hungary. All while, by the way, Orban trumpets a very pro-Israel message. We love Israel, and an increasing rapprochement with Israel through his personal connection with Bibi. Like, so, you know, autocrats love company just like anyone loves company. But here, you know, those of us who have been concerned about what's been happening to Israeli democracy over the last 10 years, this nation-state law was dispositive of a concerning erosion of Israeli democratic norms, if not the law itself. Yep, Yoel.
Especially pissed off the Druze in Israel who serve in the army and who lost many, many soldiers over the years and who have very high positions in the army.
It especially pissed off the Druze in Israel, a minority religious and ethnic community, chiefly living in the north, up in the Galilee, up in the Carmel, near Haifa, who not only are loyal Israeli citizens, but who often are stationed in high positions of service in the army. I mean, for Druze, their Israeli patriotism often plays out that, you know, they serve in high positions in the army, which is their pathway to societal inclusion and success. I'm sure we've said this over the last couple of weeks, but unlike in the States where, you know, the kind of intellectual elite find their way in the world through their colleges and universities and their, you know, and then that leads to where they might end up in the job market. In Israel, it's really through the army. Still the number one by a healthy measure of future success. Now, with the tech sector, there are opportunities for Israelis to, you know, kind of like cut their teeth in the army in a way that will allow them to be the tech lords of tomorrow. Nevertheless, I think that, Yoel, your point is very well taken. It was a thorn in the side of the Druze. And the Druze, by the way, have maintained their loyalty to Israel, sharing the Israeli sense of victimization post-October 7th. You may recall the assault of Hezbollah rockets that or missiles that landed in a soccer field, killing 11 youth, almost all of them Druze youth, not Jews. To our horror, and seemingly not at all picked up by what I like to call tentifada, the encampment movement on our campuses, seems not to have noticed that the Jews are not the only people who are Israelis and who have been harmed by terror from Israel's enemies. Okay, for another day perhaps. So in 2019, there are 3 elections in Israel in 12 months. April of 2019, September of 2019, and then again March of 2020. And no party is really able to form a stable government. Welcome to Israel. Finally, in May of 2020, and what is happening around this time? Well, Israel, like many other Western countries, is dealing with this little thing called COVID, or as it's called in Israel, Corona. Corona, meaning the coronavirus. So if you meet an Israeli, don't say COVID, say Corona. That's what they call it. Oh, you know, Bizman Corona, at the time of Corona, or Yesh li chisun Corona, I have a vaccine for Corona, the coronavirus, right? In Israel, it reached Israel before it reached here. It was actually already kind of playing out in Israel by February, heavily in February, at least a month, January, February. Israel set up very different quarantine protocols. Some of you may remember a wonderful young woman who served as our regional Westchester Shlicha, our Israel ambassador through the Jewish Agency for Israel, Omer Nisanov. She's like 29. She's awesome. We stay in touch. I visit her when I'm in Israel. And she was one of the first corona victims who had to spend 3 months quarantined in a hotel in Tel Aviv, where they set up like quarantine wards in hotels. And at least at first, Israel actually seemed to have a better grasp on how to deal with the pandemic. But then, like most countries, when Delta came around, there was like a huge backsliding, and it was a huge challenge for them. During this time, interestingly enough, the first rotation government was finally formed, in which the plan was that Netanyahu would hold power for a while, and then after a time, Benny Gantz who had cut his teeth in the military, I think he was defense secretary, defense minister. I don't know, you probably know Benny Gantz's creds. But he would take power. Anyway, the whole thing lasted like 6 months. Not even. It collapsed. It was formed in May of 2020. What is it? What's May to December? Not a lot of time. 8 months. 8 months later, the government collapsed. September 2020, meanwhile, the first Abraham Accords, or as our president now calls it, the Avraham Accords, were signed with the United Arab Emirates, with the Emiratis, the UAE, and with Bahrain, another Gulf state, very oil-rich. Later, with Sudan, which is a complete disaster today, has been for the last 20 years, completely riven by ethnic cleansing, civil war. Again, I wonder where the Gaza encampment activists are on Sudan today. I mean, you just want to talk about genocide. Whatever you want to call the gruesome toll of human suffering in Gaza at the hands of a very powerful IDF and a completely recalcitrant Hamas that uses its own civilians as shields, and that created 1,000 kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza. So there's like the Gaza Metro, as it is cheekily called. As an intelligence officer in the IDF told me shortly after October 7th, there is a second Gaza under Gaza. That's what they spent the last 18 years doing. You want to know, like, I don't know everything about what the Saudis were up to, but we know what Hamas was up to. They built a battlefield that would be absolutely ingenious, impenetrable. The whole thing is one big awful booby trap where most of the people, and they knew this, who would die would be civilians in Palestine, in Gaza. It's Gazan civilians. And I am one of those people who believes you can still talk about Gazan civilians. We talked about this last week. It's hard for me to find sympathy for a 15-year-old Palestinian boy with an AK-47, but it's hard for me not to find sympathy for that person because somebody put that gun in his hand and created the conditions for him to want to take it, thinking that this would be the best way that he could make his, way through the world. It's just immeasurably awful. These, by the way, these Abraham Accords were the first Arab-Israeli peace treaties in 26 years. Not since 1994 with Jordan had Israel actually signed a treaty with an Arab country. It explicitly bypassed the Palestinian issue. Palestinians called it a betrayal. Though, again, it's a little bit more complicated than that because one of the things of which, those who supported the Abraham Accords are most proud of is that it also pulled Netanyahu and his right-wing government back from the brink of at least talking about something that was causing great consternation in the West and on the political left, which was annexation of the West Bank. The government basically said, look, we're just going to take it. We've got 500,000 Jewish people living there. Besides, God promised it to our ancestors. There's never been any question, by the way, that the West Bank and Gaza are part of biblical Israel. Like, that's not under dispute. My issue with the occupation in the West Bank is that it's bad for Israel. Of course, it's bad for the Palestinians living there, though there is no alternative right now, no viable alternative that has been, seen. It's bad for Israel strategically. Of course, I'm a person, people ask me my opinion about a lot of things, and I've taken to providing the following disclaimer. Well, first of all, you need to know you're talking to somebody who's in the morality business, right? You want to ask me a political question, but you're talking to somebody who's in the morality business. So I think it is fair game for me to weigh in from a moral perspective. I think morally, the occupation of the West Bank is the greatest moral catastrophe of Israel's history. I don't have a solution to it. I just want to acknowledge that is, I believe, a true statement. And one that has been co-created by the Israelis and the Palestinians and every other Arab nation and empowered by the West. And especially, by the way, the completely feckless protest movement, which has done nothing to help a single Palestinian. Tell me what you've done for a Palestinian lately. Tentifada. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to teach history. Israel, again, around the same time, dealing with corona, one of the first nations to roll out a vaccination protocol, highly successful. That begins in December of 2020. I don't know if you remember. I remember the day I got vaccinated. I got vaccinated on January 6th, 2021. Yeah. That was an interesting day. It was my first official day of sabbatical ever. I finally gotten a little time off because I was completely burned out, and also I'd been serving the congregation for about 18 years at that point, and 10 as senior rabbi. And I remember just saying, put my feet up. I'm going to be the first to get a vaccine because I had hospital visitation privileges at White Plains Hospital, so they put me on the first responder list. And I said, don't you want to give this to somebody who actually saves lives for a living? And they said, no, we have more doses to get rid of. You really should be first in line. I said, okay, I won't argue with it. So I went and I got my shot. I came back and I turned on the TV and I'm like, I was so annoyed because I'm like, now I have to write a letter to the congregation and I'm on sabbatical. Like, I was watching the White House. Okay, anyway, you remember where you were. Israel was already deep into vaccine rollout a month or more before. I want to kind of like hone in on May of 2021. An operation called Guardian of the Walls was precipitated by a number of triggers. So Guardian of the Walls was another IDF raid or incursion in Gaza aimed at degrading Hamas. But some of these names may be familiar to you. There was a property dispute in a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. 4 Palestinian families were facing a legal eviction from homes that had been built in 1956, so post-statehood, but recall, at the time, Jerusalem was a divided city, right? So they were living on homes built on land that had originally, before 1948, been owned by Jewish trusts. Israeli courts ruled that the land belonged to the Jewish owners pre-1948, none of whom were still around, therefore was owned by their heirs. Meanwhile, Palestinian families had been given protected tenant status in these homes, but had stopped paying rent to the Jewish owners' families after the 1990s. So for almost 25 years, there had been a situation of non-payment. So Israel effectively accused these East Jerusalem Palestinians of being squatters on Jewish-owned land, even though none of the original landowners were part of this. So this property dispute became politicized right fast, and it became a rallying symbol for Palestinians after eviction orders were issued in 2019 and 2020, with final hearings scheduled for May of 2021. And that's why May of 2021 was a flashpoint previous to October 7th. If October 7th had never happened, we'd still be talking about May 21. Palestinians rallied around a slogan that called what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. Now, that was their framework for it. It was very powerful language, that Palestinians are being evicted by force. Again, Israel's position was, well, wait a minute, this was a legit real estate dispute. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Did Israel need to pursue this case that would be extremely public and pay the cost? That is a question that remains unanswered. Ramadan arrives at this time. And Ramadan is always a very intense and often tense time in the Middle East. It is a time marked by fasting and prayer, and you only can eat after the sun has set and what have you. And often that's when clashes begin between Palestinians and Israelis. Police placed barriers at the very popular Ramadan gathering spot at the Damascus Gate Plaza on the walls of at the walls of Jerusalem. There were nightly clashes between Palestinians and Israeli police. Late April, the last week of April, extremists on the Jewish right organized a march as a counter to the violence, or as a kind of like, I would say, a public demonstration of where they stood, and many of them were chanting Mavet la'aravim, which is Hebrew for death to Arabs. The Palestinians in the West Bank, perceiving a crisis, postponed their scheduled elections. They were supposed to hold elections for the first time in 15 years, scheduled for late May of 2021, and they cited Israel's refusal to allow voting in East Jerusalem, which is not technically Israeli. The people who live in East Jerusalem who are Arabs are not Israeli citizens. It's a really messed up situation. Arabs living in Haifa are Israeli citizens. Arabs living in Abu Ghosh, an Arab village just outside of Jerusalem, are Israeli citizens. Arabs living in East Jerusalem are not Israeli citizens. They are residents of East Jerusalem. They have papers that say as much, but they do not have passports. The Palestinian people began to protest by a gathering in Ramadan prayer en masse on the feast of Laylat al-Qadr, which is part of Ramadan, on May 7th, and there were clashes on the Temple Mount after their prayers. Israeli police actually entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this is going to be bad, with stun grenades and rubber bullets, injuring 300 Palestinians. May 10th, Hamas issued an ultimatum for Israel to withdraw its forces from both Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in East Jerusalem, and from Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount. And then the next day began firing rockets directly at Jerusalem, and the IDF began the Guardian of the Walls operation. In 11 days, 4,360 rockets were fired from Gaza. The Iron Dome intercepted 90% of them. Israeli airstrikes hit approximately 1,500 targets in Gaza, including tunnels, rocket teams, and high-rises that were identified by the Shin Bet as being headquarters for Hamas intelligence. The Gaza Health Ministry, which nobody knew much about then, this is the body count part of Hamas. Actually, most people believe that the numbers are accurate. The issue is that it does not distinguish between combatant and civilian. Okay. 256 Palestinians were killed according to their estimates, including 130 civilians according to Israeli count. So Israel says, well, that's 1-to-1. That is twice as good as it has ever been in an urban combat situation. I feel crass even saying that because I don't like talking about numbers of lives. I'm the person who will stand this spring. I hope you might consider joining us at Auschwitz, where I've never visited. And I will say, we're here because we want to stop talking in the language of 6 million, and we want to talk about this one boy, right? I want to humanize conflict. So I hate this numbers game, by the way. I also told you last week that I don't think that even the notion of proportionality in war should be factored on body count. And if you want more on that, I'll send you an article from Danielle Hartman of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Nevertheless, in urban combat especially, the idea that one civilian would die for every one combatant is unheard of, and Israel's message is that these are the measures that the IDF will go to, the lengths we will go to protect civilian life. Right? That's the narrative that Israel wants the world to know. You be the judge as to whether or not they have succeeded in getting that narrative across. I'm not even talking about whether it's factual or not. Assume it's factual, even if it's counterfactual. Has Israel been successful in persuading the West that it fights war humanely? Hamas has been very successful in convincing the world that Israel does not fight humanely. And, that has come at a price. We're going to talk more about this on December 14th. You notice that we're not really talking about the war itself. I'll get there briefly. As a result of a lot of this, surprise, surprise, the government collapsed. And in June of 2021, a new coalition comprised of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, a more centrist coalition. But in the Israeli politics of the 2020s, centrist is what would have been considered right-wing a generation ago, definitively. It is like standard garden variety right-wing. And even the left in Israel is kind of right-wing these days. What kind of, I think, illustrates this point is Imagine a world in which next November, Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister and a new coalition takes power that is a coalition of centrists and includes the Labor Party, the kind of old school center-left party. There is no conceivable prediction that would have any such governing coalition immediately proposing 2 states for two peoples. Maybe if a lot changes between now and then, but the program of the left in Israel has largely moved right. Okay, so what people in the strongly anti-Zionist camp across the world want is not a thing that is going to be achieved when Netanyahu leaves office, necessarily. That is not necessarily a pathway to a bright new dawn in the Middle East where Israel decides it's going to make peace with the Palestinians. I hate to pour cold water on everything that you might be dreaming about. I just don't see it, and neither does anyone else. Ask an Israeli. For that matter, ask a Palestinian what they want. You don't hear a lot of Palestinians talking about this either. But again, new opportunities may have been opened up by the way in which the war has played out thus far. Interestingly about this coalition, again, back to June 21, it is the first coalition ever to feature an Arab party. The Arabs actually tried a different playbook. Traditionally in Israeli politics, the Arab parties actually all hate each other and therefore remain highly splintered. You know, maybe a few Knesset seats for one, a few for another, and most don't even qualify in a national election to hold seats in the Knesset at all. So you've got Arab parties that are more communist, and you've got Arab parties that refuse to deal with Israel altogether. And you have some Arab parties that will deal with Israel and that place seats in the Knesset, always in the opposition, by the way. You've never had a majority governing coalition except this one. The Ra'am party ended up, I think, was it 4 seats in the Knesset? I forgot to put in my notes, but I think they ended up getting 4 seats in the coalition. And they decided that if we join forces, the Arab joint list will prevail in a way they never had before. It was done once, it has never been done again. Obviously, since Netanyahu's coalition held in November of 22, there are no Arabs sitting in the governing coalition in Israel. But it was an interesting experiment in Israeli history. The Arabs, to this day, are still highly fractured, and the majority position of Arabs in Israeli politics continues to be one of kind of staying on the margins and boycotting, because there are predominant voices in Arab society, even in Israel, that are very concerned about normalizing the occupation. In other words, their view is that if we accept the certain status quos that would come with being a party in the governing coalition, we would be betraying the cause of our brethren in Palestine. That's the thinking, right? So it is for them a morally intolerable position to get into bed with the governing coalition in Israel. It happened once. I don't know if it's going to happen again. Yoel.
One anecdote and one fact. The anecdote is, I think it was 40 years ago, when I was involved in politics in Israel, I asked an Arab I knew why they're so fractured, why they have so many parties. I said, get together and you'll have a voice that will have to be listened to. And the answer was very simple. It's because we're just like you.
So Yoel told an anecdote where he asked an Arab Israeli, or kind of pleaded, like, hey, why don't you guys just band together and get over your, internecine differences, and you'll actually have a voice in government? And the answer came back, a great retort was, because we're just like you. Right? Of course we won't all play on the same team.
And in terms of whether there's a possibility of an Arab party being in the next election or being in the next coalition, Bennett, who brought them in, who's one of the favorites, how much you can believe that, to replace Bibi if there are elections, has already promised that he would not do that.
Shows you where Israeli politics have moved. Naftali Bennett, who actually was the one who induced the Ra'am party, the Arab coalition, to join that government back in 2021, has pledged that should he be, the head of a new coalition, he's kind of like a favored son right now, as Israelis look to who's going to be sitting in the Knesset a year from now after the next scheduled election. He has already pledged we're not going to have the Arabs in our coalition. So, okay, lots of horse trading though, and anything can happen between now and next year, and often will. Okay, couple of other things and as we get closer to the present moment, you're definitely going to be doing, oh yeah, I remember that. There was actually for a year a relatively quiet period on the security front. There was an operation in the West Bank to break up terror cells. It was called Operation Break the Wave. The elections of November 22, again, after many failures to form a coalition, was created as a bloc with Netanyahu as prime minister, Likud joining with a handful of ultra-Orthodox parties and religious Zionist parties to create the most right-wing coalition in Israeli history. And for me, my view is most dangerous about this coalition is the normalization of Kahanist groups who subscribe to a violent ideology of Arab exclusion and elimination, of the kind preached by the late Rabbi Meir Kahana, who inspired the murder of 29 Muslims in prayer on Purim in 1994 at the hands of Dr. Baruch Goldstein, and that politics. It is accurately, as has been described, as if the Republican Party in America went all Proud Boys and decided to team up with the KKK as well and put David Duke in charge of its, a significant cabinet position. That's the level of extremism we're talking about. And so when you meet Israelis on the left, or when you meet, when you read statements from the reform movement that are highly critical of the current government, despite the fact that we love Israel, we really have no love for this coalition as a reform movement, because the values of this coalition are so invidious to what we as Reform Jews hope for the Jewish people and especially for the Jewish state. They do not reflect our vision of what the Jewish state could or should be. Unfortunately, in today's world, it is very hard to get that message across while still saying, and by the way, we love Israel. Well, I think you have to do what the Tosefta, an ancient Jewish text, most roughly contemporaneous with the Mishnah, first few centuries of the Common Era, teaches we must do, which is build for yourself a heart of many rooms, big enough to include the words of Hillel and the words of Shammai. Contradictory opinions, all in the same shared space. Okay. The biggest issue previous to October 7th for Israeli society was, of course, the judicial reform crisis. The very last days of December in 2022, so almost 3 years ago, Netanyahu's sixth government was sworn in, this right-wing government. It proposed almost immediately the following core reforms. One, something called an override clause. It would grant the Knesset power to reenact any law struck down by the Israeli Supreme Court with a simple majority of 61 votes. Knesset is 120 seats, 61 votes is simple majority. It is unicameral, one house, so very few checks and balances. It is not inaccurate to describe Israel as a political system in which the Supreme Court is the only existing check or balance on governmental power. And everything is ruled through government coalition, and the legislature and the executive branches are also entangled with one another. We'll see. I mean, say what you will about this current moment in American political life and the intention to smash norms. I still believe America benefits from a much more robustly developed system of checks and balances that limit presidential power, limit power of any one branch of government. Israel relies on its Supreme Court, and it is not wrong to take issue with the fact that the Supreme Court is extremely liberal. Out of its, 14 justices on the judges on the Supreme Court, 12, 13 are well-established liberals. It's kind of the opposite of the American Supreme Court right now. Second, judicial appointments. Politicians could gain a majority on selection committees, ending decades of an actual veto power. Third, the Knesset would limit the Supreme Court's ability to use a doctrine. This is great. This is so Israeli. The Supreme Court can invalidate a law based on something called reasonableness. Right. Yeah, it's this very nebulous term where if a majority of the judges on the Israeli Supreme Court say, yeah, what you're proposing here is simply on its face not reasonable, it can strike it down. All right. That has actually, however, been one of the most significant checks on governmental power in Israeli history. Israel does not have a constitution. This is another problem. So there's no document to appeal to for any of these. There's just traditions and precedents and what are called basic laws, which are laws. They're real laws, but they have never been constitutionalized. And finally, the reforms would turn the government's legal advisors' opinions from binding to merely advisory. So the whole thing was parsed by the left as a full-scale putsch on the political norms of Israeli life, a full-scale assault on anything that would restrain Netanyahu's coalition from enacting whatsoever laws, howsoever and whensoever it so chose. Right? That was the real issue. Okay, you don't take it from a Reform rabbi standing in Scarsdale. Take it from the somewhere between 150 and 500,000 Israelis who took to the streets every single week, every week after the reforms were first proposed to make, and by the way, who was financing these? Israel's tech sector, billionaire tech lords were financing this. Huge influence from former, highly placed IDF folks. This was not a rogue, this was not Occupy Wall Street, all right? This was not a fringe movement of idealistic beatniks. This was core Israeli society standing up to its own government and saying, not on my watch, not in the name of my Jewish state. We're not going to be undemocratic in that way. And we all know when this ended. It ended with one of the largest protests, which was the night of October 6th, 2023. Come back in a few weeks and we'll pick up there. But I've so been gratified by your interest. And for those of you who are streaming online, thank you. Feel free to like and share our video podcast with others. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And as promised, I hate to do this, but I'm literally putting on my jacket and walking out the door so that I can start putting food in the oven. Thanks, everyone.